we have to talk about sheriffs now. And what are they? What do they do? Are they any good? Or are perhaps not good? As it turns out, it is very easy to get extremely basic and one-sided information about this job, because current sheriffs love to talk about how being sheriff works, and the history of sheriffing. Hey, did you know that the term sheriff comes from a combination of the word shire, meaning local community, and reeve, meaning an official who collects taxes and enforces the king's orders? Turns out, this is the #1 favorite sheriff fact among sheriffs.
To understand the origin, we must travel back to what is known today as England, where the term reeve referred to a chief or leader, and the term shire described groups of hundreds of people banded together, which is what we would today call a county.
The word sheriff is derived from the shire reeve, which hails back to England, where the land was divided into geographical areas called shires.
The history of the office, we can go back at least to the year 890 AD. So we're talking 1100, 1200 years ago. King Alfred was on the throne, and he wrote this document called the Book of Dooms. It sounds like some kind of modern-day video game or something, but really it was about crimes and punishments.
Cool. History. I got it. Things are named, time goes forward, etc. But generally speaking, the image they want to invoke the most is old western sheriffs protecting townsfolk by shooting the hats off of bad guys' heads. It's weird they're going back to medieval Europe in these videos, considering that there's a single specific sheriff we associate with those times. You know, the Alan Rickman types, who in the absence of any real accountability, consolidated and entrenched authority before openly abusing it for personal and financial gain until they were shanked by a forest squatter. Anyway, the point is that learning about sheriffs is probably not best done by looking at resources from sheriff departments. But if you want to, you could check out the National Sheriff's Association homepage. They have a whole resource section with tips on how to stay safe on social media, right next to an article about why it's not their fault when they shoot people with mental health problems. So typically, depending on the county, sheriffs tend to run local jails, handle courtroom security, enforce court orders, and serve court processes. But their duties can also include basic law enforcement tasks, especially if the county is rural and has a lot of unincorporated areas. And this changes a lot from state to state, depending on what's outlined in the Constitution. In California, the sheriff also serves as the county coroner. And in Colorado, the sheriff is also the county's chief fire warden. Most state constitutions require that every county elect a sheriff, which of course is a big difference between sheriffs and police chiefs, who aren't elected but usually appointed by the mayor. And while the chief of police answers to the local government, the sheriff answers directly to the voters. In theory, all caps. Also, there's a difference between an office and a department, apparently. A sheriff's office is a totally independent law enforcement agency that's run exclusively by a sheriff with no input from any other agency or official. A sheriff's department, on the other hand, is part of the executive branch of county government. It still has some independent authority, but not total. This is all to say that while perhaps, theoretically, there are good sheriffs out there, the real problem is that the entire sheriff system is incredibly bad, and is seemingly set up to encourage them to act with total impunity. And I'm going to explain why. With my mouth, and tongue, and maybe some other parts of my body, depending on how furious I get. For starters, most states initially wrote the power of their sheriffs into their constitutions, making it nearly impossible to actually change their duties or eliminate them entirely. Also, remember how I said a moment ago that they aren't appointed but voted in? Well, because of that, it's actually really hard to get rid of a sheriff if they do something wrong. In California, for example, you either have to amend the county charter to allow a vote, do a recall election, or trigger a grand jury trial, which takes a while to do. And since they aren't technically affiliated with the political party, even though they absolutely can be, foreshadowing, most of the time there's no huge pressure for them to step down. Not to mention that news of corruption rarely makes it to the national stage. But also, even if they do cause a national scandal or have a lot of people asking them to leave office, if a sheriff simply doesn't want to resign, more often than not, they just refuse to. Seriously, they can just stay put like they're James Cromwell glued to a Starbucks counter, a thing we did not make up. Even in counties like Los Angeles, which has a sheriff's department, not an office, the actual Civilian Oversight Commission is still just purely advisory. In 2020, the board unanimously called on current LA Sheriff Alex Villanueva to resign, and not only did he not do it, he ran for re-election instead. And that... it's the opposite of resigning. Sheriff Alex Villanueva was the first Democratic sheriff in over 130 years and campaigned as a progressive reformer. One of his big promises was to create a truth and reconciliation panel for citizens injured by sheriff's deputies. But that turned out to just be a way for him to rehire shitty cops who were fired for things like domestic violence. In fact, since his election in 2018, he has been accused of removing his department's constitutional policing advisors, allowing violent deputy cliques and gangs to operate with impunity in his department while dismissing them as people who go to the river and party, violating the First Amendment rights of protesters and journalists covering protests, and pursuing a criminal leak investigation against an LA Times reporter who was investigating an incident in which a deputy kneeled on the head of a handcuffed inmate for 3 minutes. In the same year, Villanueva refused to resign. LA County voters overwhelmingly turned out to support Measure R, which gave even more power to the Civilian Oversight Commission to investigate misconduct by the Sheriff's Department, specifically the ability to issue subpoenas. The state of California also passed Assembly Bill 1185 later that year, which did this on a larger statewide level. That former measure got 72% support from the voters, but ultimately, neither of these measures do enough to remove a sheriff from power. And in the case of Bill 1185, it's still up to the counties to even create an oversight commission in the first place. And the same story played out in San Francisco. In 2020, voters approved the creation of a civilian sheriff's department oversight board, but they're not actually empowered to discipline the sheriff or deputies. I guess they can just leave them passive-aggressive notes or something. And even that only happened after 3 deputies were accused of staging gladiator-style combat between inmates at the county jail, which is just like making them do regular combat, but you give them a dramatic thumbs up or thumbs down when they finish. Also, Ridley Scott directs the action. Haha! Fuck the police. By the way, as of this year, there are only 160 civilian oversight committees in the United States, which is roughly 17,840 fewer than what we need. And of those committees, only 6% actually have the power to impose punishment on officers that do harm. And so most often when a sheriff does something fucked up, most counties have no idea who can even punish them. Hey, thanks for watching that clip. Here's the evergreen end plate to ask you to like and subscribe. It's any day of the year where you are.